Hi, I'm here to talk to you today about briefing a case. This can be a little bit tricky if you haven't done it before. Before we get started, make sure you've looked at the case briefing basics handout in the readings folder, and also take a look at. I've added a sample case brief for Plessy versus Ferguson. Take a look at that. You don't need to read the case itself. If I've done a good enough job on the brief, you should be able to understand what the case is about just by reading my brief. So hopefully I was successful there. So if you take a look up at the top, I put the case name, which is Plessy versus Ferguson. It's fairly simple. Sometimes case names can be a bit more complex, but we often abbreviate them anyway. So even if you look at the decision itself, there's a very long case name. There's 3 or 4 plaintiffs, 3 or 4 defendants, something like that. Usually we just go with either the last name of the first person listed or the organization name of the first organization listed. So don't get too worried about that. Underneath you'll see the citation. So this is what you could use if you were looking this case up in Lexis to find it. You don't have to really know a whole lot about what those numbers mean. Little hint there that US in the middle, it's a 163 US 537. US means it's a United States Supreme Court case. So anything that has that US number or letter in the middle of the heading was a case decided by the US Supreme Court. It's not going to be a state case. It's not going to be a lower level federal case. And the more cases you'll read, you'll start to figure out what those mean. So not tremendously important. What is important here, though, is the date. I included 1896. Now, we don't need to know the exact date of oral argument. We don't need to know the exact date that the issue was handed out, but the year makes sense. Particularly in this case, it's going to be probably obvious to us as we talk about this that the case is well over 110 years old. So the first section of the case brief that we talk about is the procedure. That is, how did this case get to the court that issued the opinion? In this case, the U.S. Supreme Court. So we talk. This is maybe I think it is the longest section of my brief here. You don't want it to be too long though. There's a lot that you can talk about with procedure, but very little of it's actually important when it comes to understanding the case. So for here, I did a one sentence statement of what the law at issue is. So what was the Louisiana law? It said that African Americans could not ride in the same railway cars as whites. Plessy was convicted of violating the statute. Real simple. There's the law. There's that's who Plessy is, and that's why we have a case. I tell you then next that the presiding judge at the trial was Ferguson. That's not really important, other than the fact the case is called Plessy versus Ferguson, so we need to know who Ferguson is. Turns out, because of Louisiana appellate procedure in 1890s, the trial judge is named as the defendant on appeal. But that's the only time we're going to hear Ferguson's name in this case. He just was the trial judge. He enforced the law as it was. So for that reason, his name gets attached to the case. But he really isn't significant to it. Throughout the remainder of the brief, I'm going to basically just describe Louisiana when we talk about who Plessy is really suing, because that is who he's suing here. He wants Louisiana to change what it's doing. He doesn't really care that much about the particular judge who has assigned his case at trial. So then I give a very basic summary of what Plessy is trying to do here. He wants his appeal overturned, and he wants the state to stop enforcing this segregated railway law. And his argument there, again very briefly, is that segregating train passengers based on race amounts to denial of equal protection under the 14th Amendment. And then we do just a quick summary of how did we get from that trial court all the way to the Supreme Court. So first we went to the Louisiana Supreme Court. Plessy lost there. Then we go to the U.S. Supreme Court. And then we're going to briefly say, what did the Supreme Court rule? It ruled against Plessy. He lost in a 7-1 decision. So that means 7 judges voted on behalf of Louisiana. The other judge voted for Plessy. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And not important, but one of the other judges just didn't take part in the proceeding. So the facts here, you can see are really brief because most of what really mattered was explained in the procedure. So all we need to know is that Plessy was convicted of violating the Louisiana statute when he refused to give up his seat in a whites-only car. I added in a little parenthetical that that Plessy is of 1/8 African descent. That's not at all important to the legal reasoning, but I included it because it's a historical fact that's often included when you see this case discussed. It also, for historical purposes, they chose Plessy was part of an organized effort to have segregation overturned, so they wanted to choose somebody who did not look black. He's only 1/8 black, so he could fit in the whites only car without being noticed. And then they essentially they informed the railroad and said, hey, this guy, he actually has some African descent, so what are you going to do about it? And of course they tried to throw him off the train and had him arrested. But not tremendously important. That's why I put it in parentheses there. I could have very easily left it out. It's simply enough to say that Plessy was considered African American for the purposes of this statute. So the issue then, so facts should be short. The issue section of the brief should be like a one or two, maybe three, depending on how many issues are at stake in a case. Questions that this was the court is being asked to decide. So we phrase it as a question. So did Louisiana violate Plessy's right to equal protection under the law under the 14th Amendment by forcing him to ride in a segregated train car? So we want to include enough of the facts to show what was this case about. So we have a segregated train car. We don't get into any more detail than that. We don't have to talk about how he's 1/8 black and 7/8 white or anything like that. But just what was the basic factual dispute, and then what's the legal theory? So this equal protection, that's our legal theory, and did the court violate his rights? So it can be a little bit tricky when writing a brief. You want to include enough information that we know exactly what the case is about, but not so much that we're getting bogged down. Remember, we have a fact section that'll give us maybe more details if we need it. But it should be phrased as a yes or no question that the court is being asked to answer. And again, some cases there might be 2 or 3 issues. So it's some cases are simpler than others. Now the rule section, this is the rule that the court is going into the case having to enforce. So it's not necessarily what the court may, especially if we're talking about the U.S. Supreme Court, might change what the rule is. But in this case, it's the rule going into the case. This is what the court's using. So I wrote, under the 14th Amendment, states may not deny equal protection under the law on the basis of race. So as we'll see, this is what the court has to do, is decide what exactly does that mean in this case. And that's the analysis section. This is the most significant part of a case brief. This is where you explain why the court reached the decision that it did. Now it's important to note in this case we have 2 decisions. The majority was written by Brown, and he argued that the 14th Amendment required states to treat people equally under the law, but it didn't require states to sort of go beyond that, to enforce social equality. The opinion uses to abolish distinctions between the races, or to force commingling of the races. That's the word the opinion uses. So so he argued that keeping races segregated did not really amount to discrimination. As long as we really have separate but equal accommodations. Now, as a historical fact, these were not equal accommodations. That the accommodations that were for blacks were always worse than the ones that were for whites. So that was not an argument based on fact, but nevertheless it was the law of the land for about 60, 70 years. Now in dissent, Justice Harlan argued the point that eventually would take the day, and that is segregating people was inherently discriminating. That to say that one group of people isn't good enough to associate with another amounts to discriminating against that group. So so Harlan would have voted or did vote in favor of Plessy, but he lost the day. So the analysis part, we really want to focus on the reasoning. Why did the judge decide the case this way and not that way? And that can help you sort of understand how to apply this reasoning to a similar case. So if we get a case like this down the road and we have to guess, how will the Supreme Court rule on this? We can look at the court's reasoning and how it decided the earlier case to figure it out. So then the holding, this is our takeaway, or it might be called the conclusion, but this is a one-sentence statement, maybe more than that depending on how many issues are at stake in the case, but usually it's pretty short, and this is just what if we had to summarize this whole case in one sentence, or at least this issue in one sentence, what would that be? So for Plessy versus Ferguson, I wrote that where accommodations for different races are separate but equal, states do not violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment by imposing racial segregation. So I used enough information there. We want to know why might it be illegal? We have to talk about the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, to say this is the theory that that Plessy raised, but he lost on it. And the separate but equal language is important. That became the language that Brown used in his decision, and that was used for the next 60 years in cases that were denying plaintiffs like Plessy. So it's important to if there's key language that's used in the decision, go ahead and quote it. You don't have to put everything in your own words. You don't want huge blocks of quoted text. Just think for a few choice phrases in there that the court might have used that you think other courts might be citing, quoting later. So, so the key in a case brief is to be succinct. You want to provide enough facts that we know exactly what went on in the case, and enough support for the court's argument. But if we want to read the whole case, we can read the whole case. This should be just a very quick summary. My case brief here is 341 words. So this is a little bit simpler case. Some cases are more complicated, but you shouldn't have any trouble coming in under 500 words for something like this. And a longer case might be longer, but you want to just focus on the things that really matter.